I recently did a video comparing the American comic book industry to the East and mangas and what they're doing out there in South Korea. And I got this really interesting comment on it that I wanted to go through. This gentleman says, you don't see manga creators hating on other manga creators. They're too busy working on projects. If anything, they salute each other. Out here, the Rippaverse success got so many American indies taking shots, and it's one of the reasons they're winning. People rather sabotage than create. And I believe when he says they winning, he's not talking about like the Rippaverse in general. He's talking about like the East. And yeah, they are kicking the Americans' ass in their own industry. It is something that's sad to see. I'll say this much. It is a problem. It's not just a comic book thing. I think it's just an American arts thing. It's very catty. Unfortunately, people look at other people's success as if it's a detriment to them. So they look to kneecap them. They look to advance their own careers, or thinking that it's going to advance their own careers by taking out other people. And it's just a common theme. It's been one of those things you hear all the time, like in the mainstream, these back channels and people going out of their way to try to cancel other folks and hoping that they slide in those spots. I do think that there's a difference, obviously, between fans having their opinions on if somebody's giving work or story or whatever. They're going to always argue. They're going to always debate. To your point, I do believe that has a lot to do with why it's just not as attractive of an industry. I mean, you find so many young people, even as aspiring creators and artists, they're adopting the style of Japanese. It's not to say that they probably out there in the East don't deal with that sort of stuff, but it's really, really bad out here. For sure, as people comment on like the comic pros, it's a different conversation when we're discussing like them running a character into the ground or using like these characters that they didn't create for their own personal social agendas and people calling it for what it is. That's not the same as like trying to again cripple someone or cripple their career just because like they are further along the line than you. I don't know if you guys noticed, like I stopped doing for reviews, for example. I stopped doing a lot of stuff that I used to do when I was just a general consumer, just a general customer, than what I do right now because I knew I was entering into a new spot, and it's just for the sake of like professionalism, it's not really conducive to where I want to be. And it certainly doesn't help the industry by like constantly trying to talk about what other people are doing. And that's what I did when I entered into this space. And I think that's just, I think that you'll see a comeback with the American industry, or rather it be an indicator when you start seeing people that have that sort of attitude where it's like, sure, you might not like someone else's work, but look, there's only so much time in the day. Probably should be focused on your stuff, and even more so if you have to talk about someone else's stuff, maybe uplifting their material over trying to destroy them when they're doing their own thing.